thank you for joining me tonight, this November 8th, 2021, for this edition of the Daily Intelligence Briefing. This is the video series where we cover the headlines in Christian polemics and discernment news, and it is not 10 minutes or less. Not going to be 10 minutes or less. In fact, on this edition here, I'm probably going to get a little bit deeper into at least one of these stories. I want to start with a couple things that broke fairly recently. Some of you may have already seen. By the time this video goes up, certainly there'll be some talking about it in the news. But Christian polemics websites are covering it. We're going to cover it as well. Before we get to those headlines, though, the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is, of course, the greatest news. Gospel of Jesus Christ is the good news that God loved you and me and those of us that believed in him so much that he sent his only son, Jesus Christ, to the world to live a perfect life and die on the cross in our place. Jesus paid the price for our sin, paid the price for our sin so that we could be reconciled to the Father and not have to suffer the rightful consequences of said sin. Jesus died on that cross. He suffered. He died and was raised again from the dead by the power of the Holy Spirit on the third day, ascended and now sits at the right hand of the Father. That is wonderful news for you and me and all who would believe in Jesus Christ, put our faith in him, repent of our sins, and trust him for our eternal salvation. If you have questions about that, please reach out to us on any social media channel, email, comments, any of the vast number of ways we can be contacted. Or if you'd like us to pray for you, please contact us in one of those same ways. Now, on to the headlines. This coming from Reformation Charlotte has written about this headline. As evidence shows, Kyle Rittenhouse acted in self-defense. Don't forget the Gospel Coalition called him a mass shooter. Now, this has interesting implications for those of you that maybe haven't been following the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. He's basically a young man who, in the midst of a BLM Antifa riot, was armed and attacked and shot some people and was accused of murder and those kind of things, charged with those crimes, and now is facing trial for them. And as the trial is moving along and evidence comes out, it is pretty clear that that's not how it went down. In fact, one of the gentlemen who Kyle Rittenhouse shot, because I believe, if I remember correctly, two people died, one person lost his arm. This is the gentleman that lost his arm, was on the stand today, at the trial, and admitted that Rittenhouse did not fire his weapon until the other man had been pointing a gun at him, which is pretty much a textbook's definition of self-defense, certainly with as heated as things were and the speed of the action. The Rittenhouse defense team is certainly very happy about that. You can see the prosecutor with his head in his hands, just lamenting because that no pun intended, blew a hole in his case, in his prosecution of Kyle Rittenhouse. But if we rewind the clock, we have supposedly Christian gospel institutions prejudging the situation, declaring guilt before any trial commenced, certainly not looking at Kyle Rittenhouse as being innocent until proven guilty, and probably the biggest duck in the puddle was the Gospel Coalition. Now, what makes this interesting, at least to me, is we've discussed in recent days and last week some of the implications of Christians dealing with handling their sins against each other and whatnot in the civil arena, in the secular courts. Scripture teaches believers to handle those things within the church and not take them to the secular courts. For instance, Mike Stone, Georgia's Mike Stone, suing Russell Moore for defamation, and a lot of Christians saying, well, he shouldn't do that because Christians are supposed to keep it in the church. My basic argument is, well, Russell Moore isn't a Christian, so those verses don't apply. But it'll be very interesting. I don't know if Kyle Rittenhouse if he considers himself a Christian or not, if we would accept him as such, depending on what he would confess. But it presents a very interesting question. If Kyle Rittenhouse and his team decides to turn around and sue for defamation, media outlets like the Gospel Coalition, who called him a mass shooter prior to any any real evidence being presented in trial. If he's acquitted, could they turn around like the Covington Catholic kids and sue for defamation? The Covington kid, Nick something or other, I forgot, but he basically sued CNN and the Washington Post and a bunch of other media outlets for defamation, for saying things about him that were false before any evidence came out of what happened between himself and the Native American banging the drum in his face last year or the year before, or whenever that was. But he was successful. He sued CNN. He sued the Washington Post. He got a judgment in his favor. Probably part of that judgment was not revealing exactly how much that was. But this seems like a potentially parallel situation here, as Kyle Rittenhouse can very well turn this same accusation against the Gospel Coalition for defaming him, calling him a mass shooter prior to anything going down. It reminds us of when Beth Moore and some other formerly SBC loudmouths were getting on Twitter and ripping the Covington kids before any evidence came out. She still hasn't apologized for that because she's a prideful, evil woman. But those kids could have rightly turned around and sued her for the same thing. So it'll be curious to see if Kyle Rittenhouse, upon acquittal, which I would argue is likely at this point, if he turns around and sues outlets like the Gospel Coalition. The concern for us as discerning believers is this is a purported Christian organization that has clearly sinned against this young man, clearly prejudged him, clearly not taken any of the facts into account, not given him what is a right under our system of being innocent until proven guilty. They just came right out and called him a mass shooter before anything had happened, comparing him to Dylan Roof, who was a mass shooter, convicted in court as a mass shooter. So this is I'll dig into this just a little bit. So this was a quote from a Gospel Coalition article entitled "Why I Hate August" from Edward Copeland at the Gospel Coalition. I'm going to click on this to see if they've put it down. Apparently they haven't pulled it down. So this article here from the Gospel Coalition of August of last year, this gentleman, K. Edward Copeland, talking about why he hates August and still haunt. He goes into some things. He says right here, this August, however, the hurt is amplified by an egregious contrast. Kyle Rittenhouse killed people in the middle of the street on camera in front of witnesses, then, smoking rifle at his side, casually strolled past law enforcement. He didn't run away. He didn't hide. Showed no fear. Gets into it. And then right here says, when armed mass shooters like Kyle Rittenhouse and Dylan Roof, who, by the way, was a school shooter, convicted school shooter, who did kill a bunch of people in, not in self-defense, but certainly murdered them. So he refers to Kyle Rittenhouse here as a mass shooter. A lot of us took issue with that at the time because we saw the footage, we knew what was described, and yet a trial hadn't even commenced. There was no evidence that had been adjudicated in the system. So this is something that we're going to follow and find out what happened. But the summation of this basically is we have once again, the Gospel Coalition very willingly and happily taking the position and the framework of the secular media and versus the God-given rights that are part of the jurisdiction of the United States. How we do our legal system and what we believe comes from being a human being created in God's image. You're innocent until proven guilty because we believe that every human being has that intrinsic value as a creation of God. It'll be very curious to see how this happens going forward, but suffice to say, it is yet another black mark against the Gospel Coalition, or as we sometimes like to call them, the Social Gospel Coalition. Our next headline, and this actually was revealed even later in the day today, so much so that the website that put it up is suffering from what seems like a crash based off of traffic, people trying to get to the website. This was at the Defender, which is Robert F. Kennedy's website. For those of you that don't know, the um, Robert F. Kennedy, the kind of he's sort of an anti-vaccine advocate and that kind of a thing. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He's someone who, a few years ago I would say he's a little kooky. Being anti-vaccine this way is a little kooky, and yet as the government has decided to use vaccine policy and authority issues related to it as a wedge to as a cudgel against the people, I've started to listen to him a little bit more closely and really take him a little bit more seriously. This is really just a news piece. There's not too much opinion in it. And I've pulled up the archive.com version of the piece headline: Governor Gavin Newsom injured by Moderna booster shot. A lot of us had suspected that something was going on because he virtue signaled getting his third shot. You can see it in the picture here on the article. I believe this was the picture from the third shot. So he takes gets his Moderna booster or whatever, third shot on October 27th, and then just disappears. And we don't see, he still has yet to make a public appearance. And we saw the timing between when he got this shot and his disappearance, and suspected something might be going on because there are side effects with these things. His wife tweeted out, I believe yesterday, a tweet in defense of, well, he's just working. You all need to get a life. He's just working. This, she was incensed and defensive of him on Twitter. I would describe it as incensed, and then deleted the tweet. Now, if he really was working, would her defense of him not be legitimate? It would be legit to, be defensive that, hey, he's busy working, quit giving him a hard time. He doesn't need to show up for you people whenever you want. And yet she deleted the tweet, which is led many of us to believe there's more to this. It's not just a conspiracy theory. And now we see this reported, this at the Defender at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s website here, saying a source close to California Governor Newsom today told the Defender the governor experienced an adverse reaction to the Moderna COVID vaccine he received. The source, who asked not to be identified, said Newsom's symptoms were similar to those associated with, I believe it's pronounced Guillain-Barré syndrome. I'm sure you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. GBS, which is a known side effect. It's a neurological disorder, and it basically ranges all the way from minor symptoms all the way to not being able to control your breathing. It can be very serious, this syndrome. It's a syndrome where your body's immune system attacks parts of your nervous system, including nerves around the brain and the spinal cord, and it can cause all sorts of pretty serious issues. But the main part of this headline is that the governor hasn't been seen in public since he was photographed on October 27th. So, yeah, actually, and they've screenshotted the tweet from his wife down here saying, this was yesterday, roughly 24 hours ago. She tweets out, "It's funny how certain folks can't handle truth. When someone cancels something, maybe they're just in the office working. Maybe in their free time, they're at home with their family, at their kids' sports matches, or dining out with their wife. Please stop hating and get a life." Now, I'm sorry, first of all, what public figure in politics says, quit hating? Quit player hating, y'all. He's just working. Quit hating. Like it's a little immature to begin with. But she pulls this tweet down. Now that it has come out and leaked, apparently, that he's been injured. Now, what makes this especially interesting is he's been one of the primary proponents for forcing this on everybody else, including children. Ask any Californian how ridiculous it's been out there. I'm over in Colorado here, and it's not quite as bad, but we usually, we try to trail behind what California is doing eventually. We'll catch up. And so I'm hoping maybe this will get some of those who have been indoctrinated into this mandate cult to back up and say, hey, maybe there are reasons someone might not want to take this. Maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be. We'll see. Moving on to the next headline here. This from Protestia. back home to protestia.com, where you can find all the latest headlines in Christian polemics and discernment news, as well as podcasts from yours truly and daily intelligence briefings when I remember to put them up. This headline reads, "Does Lifeway only carry women authors?" With a nice grid here of female authors being carried at Lifeway. And over at Protestia, we're demonstrating how much more common women authors are, female books, books written by females are in Lifeway's bookstore versus male books, except for the men's Bible study section. Although I suppose it wouldn't shock me if there were somehow female authors writing men's Bible studies at this point. We go through a list basically of the major categories: devotions and journals, mixed Bible studies, new and best-selling fiction, Christian living, fiction you might have missed, Christian books on family issues. And you can see the overwhelming number of the authors listed here are women. There's a few men here and there kind of sprinkled around. You see, well, and, in some of these I might put men in quotes, but you know what I mean. Mixed Bible studies, you got Matt Chandler here, along with his acolyte Jen Wilkin, Priscilla Shirer of Beth Moore Buddy fame in the SBC. You got in devotions and journals, we're seeing Tony Evans, which a lot of evangelicals still remain ignorant about who he really is. Paul Tripp, who I'd have to put male in quotes in a lot of ways for that one. Down here you have, former SBC president J.D. Greer of Summit Church. Again, Tony Evans. And I mean, you can see how many of these are females. Jackie Hill Perry, I might put that in quotes too, for reasons that we've talked about in the past. J.D. Greer and J.T. English, who preaches just down the street from me, just down the street from where I live. J.T. English, he's a Matt Chandler acolyte who's come out here to the Arvada area to pastor a church. And there's more I'd like to say about him than I have time for in this video. But one of the things I think we have to realize, and I'm gonna pontificate here a little bit with regard to why the female authors are so much more popular than the male authors. Part of the reason is that women are naturally more verbal, naturally more relational and emotional. So books and reading and language and things appeal to them more. And so I think that they're more likely to go and look for sustenance and Christian teaching and these kind of things in books than men are. I suspect that's part of it, but also because I would argue that the evangelical church at large, and no place more than the SBC, has become very effeminate generally. And that basically manifests itself in churches being sort of designed around the personalities and desires of women. I think a lot of churches are very, very feminized. We are overwhelmed with characteristics of Christ that emphasize his relational softness and his peace loving, and the characteristics of Jesus that make him what's the phrase, gentle and lowly, perhaps. We lean to that side of him and sort of put away the more masculine side of the male who was the Son of God, who is the Son of God. Churches are, even in conservative theological churches where men are the pastors and men are the preachers, and they hold those positions of authority, still very often in those churches, they lean towards effeminate perspectives, or softer or more feminine perspectives than they do masculine perspectives. So I think that has a lot to do with it. You can read the rest of that article at protestia.com to get the gist. Well, we may speak about that later again. And there's always a whole litany of topics that I would like to get into on the Daily Intelligence Briefing and just don't have the time. They're better suited to the longer form polemics report, which you will see at this YouTube channel, which is why you should subscribe and click the notification bell so you see the next time it goes up. And by the way, while I'm talking about polemics report, one of the issues that I'm going to push on the next podcast, I'm going to make JD talk about it because I think we should talk about it, is what I'm calling the pearl clutching around people saying, "Let's go, Brandon," as if it's the worst thing that's ever come out of somebody's mouth. And I want to, at that point, want to talk specifically about why a lot of even normally correct and trustworthy, and still trustworthy, discernment sources online are getting this one wrong. So I think they're getting it wrong. I have my reasons. JD certainly thinks they're getting it wrong. He has his reasons, and we're going to discuss it hopefully on the next podcast. So our last headline for this edition of the Daily Intelligence Briefing, this at cbnnews.com. For the record, we do not endorse CBN, but the headline comes from them, so that's what we're going to go to. Headline: The media made it cool, so now a whopping 30% of millennials identify as LGBTQ. It's like, there's no possible way that 30% of millennials are actually LGBTQ in terms of the traditional definition of that term. And of course, the definition of that term was always you engage in homosexual behavior, you have homosexual desires, you have homosexual relationships. That was the definition, or as they add the other letters on this and say, be binary means you're somehow both, or I'm sorry, bisexual means you're somehow both straight and gay. You like, men and women. Transsexual, or now they would say transgender, and queer, which apparently means anything you want. Do whatever you want to do. But this study is supposed from Barna, who's, of course, the studier of studiers as far as the Christian community goes, and the larger culture, taking the pulse on the church and spiritual things in American culture at large. Barna Research Group is the place to go. This is a 62-page research report that was conducted by Barna and the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University and the Foundations of Freedom, a platform promoting traditional American values. So they're talking about millennials. This age group we know as millennials has been a little flexible. So if you're like me and you graduated from high school, you kind of came up right about the turn of the century. They would usually, you could either be an older millennial or a younger Gen Xer, I suppose. But generally speaking, they would say millennials would be those that graduated from high school about 1998, 1999, up to about 2010. So there's about a 12-year range there. There's, the survey described 18 to 25-year-olds right now as being younger millennials. Older millennials would be, I suppose, those older than that up to age 40. And these people comprise, like myself and JD, who would be on the older end of this, comprise 70 million adults. Millennials were the primary age for people with kids, all of this. And so this was a demographic they wanted to dig into because it's a large demographic, and it's arguably the most influential demographic in the country right now. Now, according to the report here, 29% of younger millennials are counted as having some type of mental disorder. 54% of those surveyed acknowledge some degree of emotional fragility or even mental illness. That seems significant. 24 out of 25 lack a biblical worldview. So millennials largely do not accept the Bible's teaching on the big questions concerning the world. 75% say they lack meaning and purpose in life. That's a problem. And only one third claim to believe in God. Now this is an interesting stat as far as I'm concerned, because it's something like 80 to 90% of Americans would say they believe in God. So you're telling me that this large demographic, which comprises, if I'm doing the math right off the top of my head, about a quarter, maybe a little less than a quarter of the country, 1/3 of those say that only 1/3 say they believe in God. I find that hard to believe. Says here 39% of younger millennials 39% of younger millennials identify as LGBTQ. So according to this poll, close to 40% of people between 18 and 24% are identifying as LGBTQ. Yeah, they're not LGBTQ. So the question is, why would they identify as such? Remember that this is a self-reported poll, so it's not like they go out there with some sort of gay test kit and figure out who's gay and straight and all those things. They just say, what do you think you are? And apparently they're reporting I'm LGBTQ. Now, my argument, of course, and I think the article might make this a similar point to this, is that, well, that's the trendy thing right now. It buys you automatic virtue, automatic attention, automatic value to be part of this newly minted protected group. The article says that Barna told Newsweek he attributed the unusually high numbers of millennials being LGBTQ to social and news media coverage that makes it safe and cool for young Americans to identify that way, whether or not it represents their actual sexual orientation. Now, I don't know if Barna is accepting the sort of secular definition of sexual orientation. That we don't. But in terms of, my question would be, does that actually define their behavior and their proclivities? Does that define their attractions, or are they more attracted to just having automatic virtue and being in a protected class? And because we certainly have a culture of victimization where Americans are in some sort of virtue or victim Olympics, and whoever can claim the most reasons to be put upon, the most reasons to be persecuted wins. So, someone like yours truly, I get no reasons, right? It's if you're Protestant and middle class and white and male, 4 strikes, you're out. You lose the virtue Olympics. But if I turned around and said, hey, I'm gay now, well, at least I have one thing, right? At least I have one thing that I can say, hey, people are on my case. I'm being hated on for this. And so I suspect that that's a big part of why these millennials, which are a notoriously, I'll say this as arguably a millennial, notoriously a selfish and self-centered and immature and illiterate, mal-educated bunch for a whole host of reasons. And some of those criticisms could hold true in any American generation, but I'm certainly most familiar with mine and those who are slightly younger than me, and it's not good. It's not a good thing. And the survey really describes that when it talks about 75%. And I'm not taking this, by the way, at face value. I'm not saying that this is true. Like, I mean, the 39% of youngers identifying as LGBTQ is ridiculous. There's no way that's actually possible. But 75% saying that they lack a meaning and purpose in life, that sounds like a question that could very much be tilted by this victim culture that we're running into. So if you see a question on a survey like this that says, do you lack a meaning? Do you lack a meaning and purpose in life? And of course, these navel gazers who are millennials look down at this. Now that you mention that, I think I do. I think I do lack a meaning and purpose in life. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I do need help. I am special. I do have problems. I did survive the age of COVID. Look at me. Or whatever it is. Some of these answers and these results, I think, can be very skewed by how the questions might have been asked and the current things that society is going through right now. But you can find this over at Protestia. We have part of this and then a link to the original article. So you can go to Protestia to find your way over to it and judge for yourself. Leave a comment in there if you think I got that wrong or you think there's another reason that I'm missing, please. Anyway, we appreciate you joining us for this edition of the Daily Intelligence Briefing for November 8th. We will see you next time.